Hi, everybody. I'm Joe. Hello. Hopefully, I'm on.
Hello.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good.
Oh, I'm missing a beer. Hold on. Excuse me. Missing the first beer. It's never good. So I was gonna start the tasting here with some Pearly. It's a fine way to start any session if you guys have that handy. I'm gonna crack it and we'll let any stragglers get in. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Well, I've done a few of these in the last few months, and they're always fun. So, I mean, my general rule of thumb is I'm going to just kind of walk through the beers in the order that I think makes the most sense. I'm going to try not to drink 9 beers on camera with you guys in the next 90 minutes. That probably wouldn't go so well. But I'm going to sample through each of them, talk about them, give you guys opportunity to ask any questions after each beer, and then we'll just kind of keep it rolling, keep it lively. So feel free to give me a shout. I don't think I can unmute you or mute you from here. So I'm just going to roll, and I think probably default to mute. And then if you have any questions, we'll go from there. But if you're just joining us, we're drinking Pearly. This is our wheat beer, our Belgian style wheat beer. Pearly was kind of a pun on Pearly White. And it's a beer that we designed early on to kind of link some of the origins of Jack's Abbey and Springdale together with our barrel program. So we were formed about 4 years ago, and 4 years ago we decided, as a family of Jack's Abbey, we really wanted to experiment with fermentation character and flavor in our beers in a way that we didn't as Jack's Abbey. So that was kind of the genesis of the idea. There were some barrel projects going under Jack's Abbey with some wild yeasts and lager yeasts, and there was a lot of experimentation going there, but that experimentation kind of went outside the bounds of lager yeast, and that's where Springdale was formed. So the 3 brothers that own Jack's Abbey also own Springdale. Springdale was actually the name of their grandfather's ice business. They like to say the first business in the family that was successful, because there was some failed entrepreneurship before that did not result in success. But my understanding is the Springdale neighborhood Connecticut needed an ice chest business, and that turned into an ice business, which turned into couple generations now, the 3rd generation of entrepreneurship, which we're pretty proud of. But this beer, Pearly, the way that it links kind of our what we do that's special at Springdale is the fermentation character. The big character in this beer, if you get your nose in it, is kind of funky, fruity, spicy. Most of that character is driven by Belgian style yeast. So Belgian style yeast is really expressive, loves warm temperatures, and really speaks a lot in the finished product. Compared to lager yeast, for example, lager yeast ferments a lot colder, does not produce the same amount of fruity characteristics, and typically dries the beer out more. So you usually get a little bit more sweetness in our ale program, and that is the case here. Now we're accentuating that with coriander and orange peel, which are traditional ingredients in a beer like this. We like to kind of joke about country style wheat beer. So we feel like this beer has some acidity. We use a little bit of acidulated wheat in the mash of this beer. And that acidity just kind of keeps that tang on the finish of this beer. It kind of keeps it from being overly sweet. We think it makes an excellent oyster pairing as a result. We love that light tanginess, that big bready wheat character, and that spice. And we joke around that it's a country style wheat beer because there's been so many examples of really great, well-made wheat beer, but most of them are built on the idea that Hoegaarden is the Belgian wheat beer that defines Belgian wheat beer. But really they were kind of like traditional beers that didn't have a lot of industrialization back in the day. And so the Hoegaarden example is an example of what one man's vision for that style was and what it tasted like in his town. But what we try to do is kind of jump a couple towns over, have some acidity, have a little bit of funk in it, and that kind of will speak to the rest of our program too. It speaks to other things we're doing with barrel fermentation and stuff like that. Do you guys have any burning Pearly questions? I'll take that as a no, but it is tasty. I'm going to say it's tasty. Now, does everybody here have, how many beers do we have here? We have several bottles and several cans, I think, in total for most of you.
A total of 8, I think.
Cool, cool. I'm also looking at 8 beers, so that's good. We did something right to start.
All right, I'm sorry to interrupt, but what was the first beer we had? I'm a little bit late to the party.
Oh, hey, Bikram, how are you? We're drinking Pearly.
Okay.
Pearly White.
Oh, Pearly White. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So I was mentioning how this kind of connects to our sour program in a way. And I think a nice way to transition from this beer to our sour program is to maybe try one of the barrel aged beers here that has a little bit of funk to it. So, do you guys have fruits and shoots in your kit?
Yes.
Yep. Great. I'm going to open that one next. This beer actually uses mango and basil. It was born of a really fun barrel project discussion that we did with a restaurant called Bronwyn in Somerville. They had come to us wanting to do like a barrel project beer for their patio for the summer. They came to us with the idea of doing I think it was a mustard seed beer that they came to us for. So through, let's say, skilled negotiation, we were like, we think if we make a mustard seed beer, it won't taste very good. So what we got to is they really love the flavor of basil with their food, just like traditional kind of German food, which I thought was kind of interesting. So we ended up, in that case, making a pineapple basil beer, but we loved the character of basil in the finished product. So we ended up playing around with a bunch of different fruits in our barrels, and we did a mango and basil beer, which is fruits and shoots. So I jumped to this one next, and typically if we were doing a tasting together at the store, I might do all the canned beers first, but I get to like kind of draw a thread between these here. So the Pearly base beer, before we spice it, before we fruit it, just that base beer with Belgian yeast is a really great vehicle for flavors that come out of barrels. And from those flavors that come out of barrels, we get all sorts of acidification in our oak. You can use oak for a variety of things. I mean, you guys have all been to the store, so I've seen the amazing collection of wood-aged spirits in Norfolk, right? And we do age some beers in barrels to amplify our beer as if it were touching the spirit that was in the barrel before. But beers like we have here tonight, for the most part, we're using barrels as a medium for fermentation. So that extra fermentation you get in a barrel, we spur in a variety of ways. Sometimes we add fruit to those barrels. We always add a variety and blend of wild yeast and lactic acid producing bacteria, and occasionally we spice it. So this is an example of what started as a base beer that would have tasted a lot like the Pearly that we just had, that we aged in wine barrels, to which we added mango puree. Getting to mango is kind of interesting because like that pit area of a mango can leach astringency into a beer, so we had to be very careful to just use flesh and juice. And then we actually just use basil really late in the process. We learned early on that if you let a beer sit on basil forever, it ends up just tasting super basily and astringent. We just like rip the basil leaves, put them in a little muslin bag, and right before we package the beer, we kind of run the beer through that, and that picks up just the right amount of essential oil. So on the nose, hopefully you get like a pretty strong suggestion of basil. And then in addition to that sense of basil on the nose, it obviously kind of follows through, but I do get the mango first in the palate, which is funny. So like I'm smelling mango first, or smelling basil first, tasting mango, and then like the finish of the beer kind of moves back towards the basil, which I think is pretty. So it's a nice example of where like fermentation character kind of defines a beer like this. Even if you take those ingredients out and you're just tasting the base beer in the barrel, you're going to get a bunch of that acidity, a bunch of that funk already. So it's fun to see. Like how we're playing with fermentation. I think on the top of our cans we have flavored forward fermentation, which is a mouthful. I was actually born out of doing tastings like this and kind of talking about what we do and what links all of our beers together here is flavor forward fermentation. And these are two good examples of beers that, though they have extra ingredients in them, they really are driven by interesting fermentation that is way outside the realm of lager yeast. So if you were to see this beer in a glass and say like it's a golden beer, I think it's almost a play in your mind to think that like, oh, that's going to taste like a regular ale or lager. And I would say it certainly doesn't. It's definitely outside of it. It kind of speaks more to barrels. Since we have a couple other barrel things going here, I think I'll save all of my barrel wisdom and I'll ask if anybody has any questions first. Does anybody love or hate this beer? This is always an interesting question. You can cop to it. I can see 2 thumbs. And Elias's room there. Oh, more thumbs. Very nice.
Definitely. Sour beers are tough to make, Joe, right? I mean, how do you guys make this and keep your facility, kind of under control?
That's a good question. And keeping it under control is really what you're trying to do is keep the wild yeast and the yeast that we're using in these barrels away from our lager program. I think it's fair to say, to flip what I just said on its head, like if you look at a beer like this and you think you poured a house lager into your glass and it tastes like this, we've done something very wrong. In addition to that, the danger becomes not only cross-contamination, but that contamination takes a long time. So what you taste in our barrel-aged products are the effects of wild yeast in barrels over many months. If those wild yeast get into the rest of our program, those many months can go by, and by the time those many months go by, the beer is already in your home or in your keg, and then things can go awry. You can create overpressurized beer, your cans could explode. So we do that by keeping all of our barrel-aged beer next door. And by next door, I mean like relation to Jack's Abbey. So if anyone here's been to Jack's Abbey and the Jack's Abbey Beer Hall, Springdale is directly next door. We pump beer through a wall, and we brew the beer on the Jack's Abbey side, move it into our space, and that's where we introduce wild yeast. And we don't have wild yeast going back the other direction unless it's in a keg or a bottle. Now that is kind of introduces its own thing into it, but I think we'll kind of keep that conversation going as you get to some more bottles. But I think it would be fun to do and talk about the difference between a quick sour and a barrel-aged sour. So if you'll join me, I'm going to jump to Razz Hibby. You don't have to rush if you don't want to, but I think it'd be fun to talk about the difference between the two. If you have 2 glasses next to you, in fact, I think I'm going to pour them next to each other. I'm going to do Razz Hibby in 1 glass. And I'm going to do a little bit more fruits and shoots in the glass next to it. So I'm kind of hard pouring right now. I'm just kind of letting it sit. It's one of the things that we like to do just to kind of test carbonation, kind of have a sense for it. They look pretty similar right now. I can tell you that the head on the fruits and shoots will probably dissipate before the head on Razz Hibby. Everything that we do that's in a bottle has touched oak in our brewery at this point. And that actually goes for Jack's Abbey and for Springdale both. Everything that we have in any of our bottles are their living products with yeast in the bottle, and they've touched oak at some point in time. Razz Hibby is an example of kind of a new style. It actually speaks a little bit more through German brewing tradition than Belgian. And we say quick sour really to differentiate between the extended months to years long aging process of these beers that we do in barrels, as opposed to beer like this, which will take us between 3 and 4 weeks to produce. What happens in a quick sour is that wild yeast contamination effect that I was mentioning for the last beer, we don't have that same type of organism in this beer. We only have lactobacillus in this, and that's lactobacillus is the probiotic culture is in your yogurt. It is the living cultures on the back when you read about them on the back, and then it literally just converts sugar to lactic acid. Lactic acid is that like lovely, bright, spicy kind of acidity that we have in beers like this. But we have that fermentation happen in the brew house as opposed to in a barrel. So what that means is that before we boil this beer, we allow the natural lactobacillus that lives in the grain to kind of steep. In that steeping process, we get some of this fermentation of the sugar and the starch that is in the mash converted into lactic acid, and then we boil it, and then we proceed as normal. And that boiling sterilizes the wort and allows us to have a shelf-stable product where the acidity is basically locked in, and we've knocked out any of the living yeast. In that case, we'll know that we won't have any lactobacillus left over to infect anything else. Even so, we have a dedicated tank for this. It's not like we have this in like next to our normal beer program. We kind of have it set off to a side. It's actually a stupid name for the tank. The tank that we put this in is called Joe Nanny. And the only reason it's called Joe Nanny is because we ordered this tank from someone who misheard the name of our brewery years ago. And Jack's Abbey, he wrote to Joe Nanny, and it's what it still says in Sharpie on the side of this tank. So It is like in my lexicon to call this like we do this in Joe Nanny, but obviously that makes no sense to anybody but our team. But that being said, this quick sour process, you might also see called a kettle sour. We call these our Tart ales ourselves, but they're really kind of harken back to German style Berliner Weiss. So it's a wheat beer, kind of like Pearly. In the traditional sense, it would be unfiltered and it would be unspiced. In this case, we're taking an idea of a Berliner Weiss and we're adding some fun fruit to it. So we actually do 4 of these a year. It's always that kind of wheat beer with that process of kettle souring that we do in-house, and then to which we add a different flavor. That's actually does harken to a tradition. If you are in northern Germany, and this style does come from Berlin, the heyday of this style was in the 1950s, and you would order a goblet of this, and you would be served at the table with a series of different types of syrups you could add to it. So there's like raspberry and woodruff are the 2 most popular ones. Woodruff is this like neon green stuff. You can still get woodruff or Waldmeister syrup in the US. I've seen it at Carl's Sausage Kitchen on the North Shore in PBD, and it's like neon green, like non-food green. It's very interesting. So you put that in the beer and it's like a sweet sour balance between the two. So we try to hit that without asking you to assemble the beer at home. So we do all that work for you. In this case, we're talking raspberry and hibiscus. I have to say I don't name all the beers. I only name a portion of them. And I don't know how we got to Razz Hibby from this. I think we thought it was funny, and it just kept going, and we just went with it. I've actually love raspberries, and I love raspberries in beers. We've never done a straight up raspberry beer. We've always done raspberry with something, just because I feel like raspberry is so delicious and so delightful in beers and has a natural acidity by itself. So you assume acidity with a beer like that, with a fruit like that. But it also really plays well with other flavors, and I think it really, by playing well with other flavors, you can bring something else out of it. I'm going to take a sip of it now because I've just been smelling. Now, I put it in 2 different glasses here, and I started this saying I'm going to pour them both. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is to kind of talk about the difference in acidity. Now, to my mind, Razz Hibby is tart. It's got a little bit of spiciness to it, but it's pretty light. I think it's 4.75%. We usually aim at 4.5. We got 4.5 on this one. And the acidity is not as complex. So especially as we get into some of the other bottles here, some of the acidity is going to be more complex. There's going to be longer flavor profiles in those beers. And I mean, honestly, to my mind, I find that our bottled and barrel aged products have like more complexity to them. They're more food friendly. But what this is really kind of like a summertime beach crusher. Like that's what this style really does well for. It's like that light acidity, carries fruit flavor really well, and it's just kind of refreshing. It's funny, we've started with 3 fairly unusual beers, and obviously we love producing unusual and distinctive beers. We've kind of started with 3 beers that all strike a balance between sourness and sweetness. When we talk about beer and when we talk about how to taste beer, we're really talking about the balance between, normally speaking, bitterness and sweetness. That's kind of how you come up with the recipes, where you want to be and how intense you want that bitterness to be. Because that bitterness is what creates moorishness in a beer. It's what makes you want to have another sip. Now that's for 98% of the beers that are produced, and it's probably for 70% of the beers that we produce. But these 3 beers are all examples where that sourness kind of takes the place of bitterness. All 3 of these beers have hops in them. None of these beers have hop characteristics in the final product, nor should they. Especially when we're talking about our barrel-aged sour program, that long, funky fermentation we do in oak is actually inhibited by oils that are found in hops. So we don't do anything that's super hoppy and sour, because that hoppiness will actually counteract the reaction and make it take longer or kill the reaction over time. It actually kind of speaks a little bit to why historically we use hops in beer, because they're just really great at being antimicrobial. But when you want and you put microbes in your beer, you want to let those microbes have some place to play. I think hops are kind of they're kind of the big sexy ingredient in beer right now. And we're going to do 2 hoppy beers here now. I think next we'll probably hit the 2 IPAs in a row. And those big funky hop flavors are really fun to play with. They're really expressive, and they're really kind of quintessentially American in the way they express and the way American craft beer is built. But there's such like slim windows when those beers are perfect. And if you guys are craft beer drinkers, you probably know, you when you're looking for a hop expression in a beer, you have to be fairly careful with how the beer's been stored, how old it is, and how it's been treated. And it's a very temperamental animal, the hops. The thing that I love about barrel aging sour beer and funky beer in total is that funky beer is usually alive and usually will live for a long time. So any of our fruit expressions in barrels in particular, if you let them age over time, you start to travel almost into the fruit. If we're talking about a fruit beer, you start when we produce the beer and you're tasting like the flesh of the fruit, and then over time, as those sugars are continually eaten up by the wild yeast that we package with, you get more and more pit flavor, more and more flavor that is actually already in the fruit when you have it fresh. You just don't notice under all that sweetness. So that development over time is a reason to check in with these beers. It's a reason to keep these beers on hand. We have a sizable collection both at work and at home for me of these beers stored so we can check in on them. We have produced enough beers where part of like our checking in on it, like this is what we're doing tonight. We would normally do this in person at the brewery, a group of us just kind of opening some cellar bottles. But since that time's been rare, it's really nice to be able to do that with y'all today.
She has a question.
Yeah, a good amount of time to age cellar beer in the barrel age series.
Yeah,
that's a very good question, and that's part of the reason that we check in on this beer as frequently as we do, because it does change. Anything that we do in a bottle, as I think I intimated that before, is a living beer. So it's live yeast in there. That live yeast creates an environment that's good for aging over time. We typically say anything that's anything's above 5% and it's not completely hop driven and is a living product can be cellared for anywhere between a few months to a few years. There are some famous examples of classic beer styles like Orval, where if you go to Belgium and order an Orval, you can get a fresh Orval for like €3, and then a 1-year-old for €4, and a 2-year-old for €5, etc. And that beer, which is a Brett conditioned Trappist beer, they say usually 4 years is the time for that beer. And again, that's kind of assuming cool, dark conditions over time. That's what we try to give our beer. Now I'm in a not air conditioned apartment in Watertown, so I mean I have a little corner where I can hide beer that's dark and do my best. But at work we keep them cold, usually around between 55 and 68 degrees. And we had the first batches of beers that we produced 4 years ago. Those beers aren't beers that we take out very often, and they're not beers that show very well, even in perfect conditions now. But it is interesting to see how they change over time. In my travels, I have run into beer that's 30, 40 years old, treated the right way. Those beers can be absolutely revelatory. And one in particular that comes to mind is a Creek from a brewery called Bone, B-O-O-N. Looks like Boone, pronounced Bone. I think it was in 1987 or 88, and this was probably a few years ago now. It looked like it would literally have been dug out of the earth. It was covered in dirt, the labels all ripped up. And the color was this vibrant pink color, and it tasted like zero raspberries. There was no sweetness to it at all. It was completely funky. It was all taken over by all the bugs that are in the bottle, but it was its own version of beautiful. So I think a rule of thumb for what we do is we think that a couple of years you really move away from fruit character and from the fresh character towards the funk character, and it kind of depends on your tolerance between fruit and funk. And I think as we open some more bottles too, we can talk more about the difference between fruit, funk, barrel, bugs, and what we mean when we say those things. But generally speaking, if you keep them cool, you can definitely rely on those beers for a few years. I'm going to jump to IPA and kind of cleanse my palate a bit before the next sour beer. Do you guys have any questions, any thoughts before I do that? I don't want to rush y'all off these cans. I'm realizing I'm sitting alone here with a growing collection of things to drink at the end of this call. It'll be fun. I actually grabbed what we call a Draught Lab Sample. So I have a sample date of tasting only, not for sale, batch 161 of Springdale IPA, canned on July 1st. So 9 days old, our flagship IPA. So this beer for us is, gosh, we've been working on this beer for a few years now, but we didn't release this beer until this year. We've been, I think, kind of shy with playing around with hops in the brewery and for a variety of different reasons. But we're known on the Jack's Abbey side for producing really nice hoppy lagers and then really hop focused beers. And making a hoppy lager versus a hoppy ale is quite different. It took us actual years to dial into something that we felt kind of bridged the gap between what the hoppy beers that we grew up loving tasted like. And, that for us, that was kind of West Coast style IPA. I would give shouts to Green Flash West Coast IPA, Stone Ruination Volume 1, all those beers that are kind of huge hop bombs, with some of the more new school American and really New England innovation for fruit and expressiveness and quote juiciness in a beer. So we were really trying to split the difference with our Springdale IPA. I pointed out the Draught Lab thing. That is a way that we have our team kind of, if you come to the brewery at shift change, you'll see a bunch of our guys studiously pouring this type of beer into a glass, whipping out the phone and jumping into the Draught Lab app. And it's really a way for us. We do two different types of tastings on it, where we're looking for true to target. Does this beer represent what we think it's supposed to represent? And then there's a full descriptive one. So the descriptive ones help us build a lexicon of what this beer actually hedonistically tastes like to a wide variety of our team members. And true to target seeks to hit batch by batch. Are we doing it? Did we hit those flavor profiles in this beer? So every week we do between 2 and 4 different batches of beer. About 25 to 30 people do this tasting app, and then all that information gets aggregated and used over time. That's part of our quality program. And as a brewery of our size, a quality program is basically essential. The thing about making beer in barrels or otherwise is that everything that we do is a choice that affects the finished product. And what I mean to say is, when you taste a fine wine, you're tasting the expression of the terroir, the earth, and the winemaker. But the winemaker has a series of constraints, and it's especially if it's a single varietal, they're really at the behest of the fruit they're working with. That could be color, flavor, fermentation, etc., depending on the winemaker. For brewers, we are in a controlled environment, and we're taking ingredients from really quite literally all across the globe and arranging them in a way that we think expresses our vision or what we want to come out of this beer. So we have to clue into what it looks like, what it smells like, what it tastes like on a really a daily basis to make sure that we're keyed into it. I mean, I've already mentioned that some of our beers take 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 3 years. So we have to, as professional tasters, understand the difference between those beers and why we want to produce those beers, what we want those beers to express, and how they age. So we can put a date on it, saying drink this before 3 months are over. But the first thing we do is we taste it at 3 months and say, is that the right expression for us if kept cold? Keeping beer cold makes a huge difference to how it ages and how it progresses. We found we have when you walk on a tour of the brewery, the least sexy part of it are all these old boxes of original Jack's Abbey packaging. They just have numbers scrawled over it and these labels, and it's literally like 30, 60, 90 days warm, where we check in with those two. It's also how we find if something were to go wrong, we would be able to have basically a library of every batch we produce to say, we see something growing in this beer. Has it been growing there from the get-go, or is it something in this can? And how we control for that. Jack's Abbey and Springdale combined are fairly large operations, so we really can't rely on luck for that. So we have when we moved into our space 6 years ago as Jack's Abbey, we upgraded our closet-sized lab, which was actually a closet when we were on Morton Street, to an actual laboratory now with different hoods, a bunch of equipment, some of which costs as much as a year's education. And all of that to just dial into it. But I'm talking over the drinking, so let me take a smell and a drink. That is the most important asset that we have on the Springdale side in particular. You know, the lab is great to have. Quality assurance, quality control is incredibly important. You do have to want to drink the product. So this beer is the first one we've had in this tasting that really kind of expresses hop character first and foremost. And this is a balance between bitter and sweet. That bitter balance is what should leave that kind of bitter tingle on your palate as it sits there. And for me, the trick to that is that bitterness that sits in your palate a little bit. It invites the next sip because you're going to taste sweeter flavors up front, which kind of for me sates that bitterness, and then the bitterness lingers again, and then it goes for another sip, and then all of a sudden your can is gone. I've recently realized in actually through Draught Lab is that we took a couple 12-ounce cans home, and the thing about Draught Lab that's nice and why you do it at the end of your shift is that, yeah, you taste the beer, you log in your app, and then you get to drink a beer. I'm so attuned now to drinking 16 ounces of beer that when I get to the 12th ounce of a 12-ounce can, I'm like, who took my 4 extra ounces? And I realized that like now that we've produced so many things in 16-ounce cans and it's so ubiquitous as a format that like I've trained myself to be like, that is one beer is now 16 ounces. So go figure. And especially in all this home drinking we're doing now. It is dependent on the vessel for sure. I talked a bit about this being kind of a hybrid style beer for us. We kind of imagine this as a hybrid of a West Coast and East Coast IPA. You can still get one of, I think, the finest beers, produced by the American craft beer scene today. That was once a revolutionary beer, but still tastes great, and Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It was and remains this beautiful expression of Cascade hops and a fairly good expression of what West Coast hoppy beers should and taste like. Every brewer will just kind of wax poetic about this beer, and the thing that I find really like kind of funny about it is that it was, you know, at the time that it came out in the 80s, it was too hoppy, and everyone said that it was just like way too bitter. And, you know, you put that beer up now against some of the IPAs being produced by us and others, and it's night and day. It's pretty funny how tame it may seem in comparison to what's going on nowadays, but still, like, what a wonderful expression of like that hop character. And they were really early on to kind of honing into a varietal of hops and speaking to hops by what they're called, so like a Cascade hop, and saying that this is a Cascade hop beer. That, you know, to us nowadays, I think we're used to hearing like, oh, this is Cascade, this is Galaxy, this is Mosaic, etc. And it's almost like nomenclature like Cab Sauvignon or Chardonnay. But that wasn't always the case, and I think we sometimes feel that the amount of attention shared by hop varietals is sometimes gets in the way of our understanding and our sensory impacts of beers in a way. So like here, this beer is Citra, Sultano, Amarillo, and Galaxy. And Citra, as it might sound, is kind of responsible for a lot of citrus character in a lot of beers. And I think that Citra is jokingly referred to as, at this point, brewer's ketchup. Like if you screw up a beer, like put some more Citra in it, hopefully that'll fix it, make it taste more citrusy. But we kind of paired it with a bunch of different hops here that all express different things in different times. The thing with playing with these different hops and different hop varietals that's interesting is that you can express different things based on how you use a hop. So if you typically hop a beer mostly during the boil of the beer. The first kind of hops that you throw into it are going to break down and end up as bitterness in the final product. And the last hops in the boil you throw in won't break down as much, won't produce as much bitterness, will be responsible more for flavor and aroma. At this point, dry hopping is almost ubiquitous in IPAs. Dry hopping is hopping during fermentation, so outside of the boil, while the beer is conditioning, we're adding hops to beers really to spur for the most part, aromas. There's some new research that you actually do increase bitterness that way, in complex ways, but the whole our whole physiological taste spectrum is so interesting and so complex that we're still learning things about beers today that we don't really know the answer to a lot of questions. So like knowing whether or not we're actually increasing bitterness when we're hopping is still something we're learning. And for all that, I think what's interesting and what maybe defines us as brewers on both the Jack's Abbey and the Springdale side is that we're really a process-focused brewery more than we are an ingredient-focused brewery. So if you even look at how we talk about our products, like we put hops on this beer. Yes, a mix of different variety of hops to get to the final product. Deep Rock, that's a good question. That's true. Almost every beer we mix and mash. And each of those hop varietals does express a different flavors, different aromas, and used different ways can be quite different if you use them earlier or later in the boil. But the way that we use it is almost more important than the hop itself, especially if you're talking about a beer that has a variety of different hops in it. Amarillo is a pretty good example. If you hop a beer only with Amarillo, has this really intense driving bitterness that really kind of, to our mind at least, gets in the way of the final product. It's too bitter. It speaks too loudly. But as an aroma or a flavor hop, so midway through the boil, all the way through for dry hopping, you can get all these lovely resinous characteristics that are almost pine-like that I think are really, really quite pretty and not nearly as loud as if you were to use it as a bittering hop. So we say bittering hop as shorthand for hops that are used early in the boil that really just break down all the way and you don't get as many of those delicate aromas. The hop plant is a cousin of marijuana, and raw hop really has an intense characteristic to it, and really like breaking down in the kettle is really important because if you were to take a raw hop and just eat it, you just it's an easy way to ferret out someone on your brewery tour who's maybe too aggressive or too loud. When we hand out the grains, everybody can chew on a little bit of grain and taste grain and taste, oh yeah, like I recognize that from a beer. But if you give somebody a hop pellet, have them chew on that, they won't taste nothing else. And they probably won't talk very much either besides asking for water. So that the hop is a really, really interesting ingredient that gathers so much attention, but really like as a process, how we use them, the way we use them, how we bend them to our will, so to speak, I think is almost the most interesting part of hops themselves. I think a good transition would be to pour some Dang too. And in fact, I'm going to put Dang next to my IPA. Do you guys have Dang or quarantining you or both? I know we kind of talked about both. Either of those will work for this. I'm going to pour Dang because it's what I could have. We already sold out of all of our quarantine to you. Dang is more representative of a New England style IPA. So I think it's pretty fair to talk about what a New England style IPA is and what's different about them from East Coast or West Coast style. And the first thing we do when we do any of this is try to smell and taste and chat. So our regular IPA is 6.2%. Dang here is 6.5%, so pretty close. To my mind, we're expressing hops pretty differently between these two beers. And it really comes from when and how we hop the beers. So Strata and Comet are not too particularly well-known or attention-grabbing hops. There are two hops that we think express different they both kind of express melon character in different ways. And they also have like maybe more of like a lemon citrus character rather than a orange citrus character. In this beer, the base beer is a little bit different. So the base, when we talk about the grain in this beer, we're talking some rye, some Danko rye from Western Mass that we have in this beer, which rye on its own in the beer kind of creates a tanginess in the final product. There's almost not quite acidity, not quite tartness, but we almost always say tang. So if you just imagine when you eat rye bread, if you can disassociate rye with from caraway, you can kind of get the idea of like rye has a little bit more intensity to it. And here we're marrying that with some tropical fruit character and some bright hop character that comes from late hopping. It comes from an excessive amount of dry hopping in this case, so we're dry hopping a ton in our fermenters with these. We basically dry hop these beers so much that we kill the yeast when we do this. So we can't reuse any of the yeast because there's so much hop particulate in the final product. And doing that so much in the dry hop, where, as I mentioned earlier, it's more focused on aroma than flavor, drives the aroma of these beers. It drives the, quote, juicy character of these beers. And it results in beers that express hoppiness without necessarily the same amount of hop bitterness. We use the term hoppiness to describe beers that are hop focused like this, but hoppiness is very multifaceted. Hops can smell like marijuana. They can smell like candied lemon. They can smell like orange. They can smell like grapefruit. They can smell like pith. They can smell like pine resin, pine sap. They can smell like flowers. They really like the broad. There's a huge and broad characteristic that hops can express. And what I love about hop forward beers is we can pick and choose from all that, and how we use the hops kind of speaks to what is loud in the final product. What do you guys think of this compared to the last one? Anybody more on the Dang side than the IPA side? Who's on Team Dang? A few of you. Cheers. Now, the bitterness in this is actually like a little bit quieter in the bitterness in the straight up IPA, I think. The bitterness in our straight IPA is a bit longer. It feels more intense, and that really kind of does speak to that. The lineage of that is that like West Coast flavor to it. Interesting. I've not had these beers next to each other. We normally have access to draft beer all the time, so anytime a new IPA comes out, we'll just put it next to our IPA, compare them, and we so rarely had the opportunity to sit down and actually go through our lineup. It's really nice to be able to do that with y'all today. Well, I think the rest of the beers, as I see them here, are kind of going back towards the sour and the funky range. I'm going to open a little unflavored seltzer just to cleanse my palate a little bit. That is a trick that we use, is that and saltines in the brewery. It's just something kind of neutral to reset your palate a little bit as you think about moving to the next. If you guys have IPA questions and things that are more focused on our what we call our, quote, clean beer program, our non-barrel program, it might be a good time to ask some of those, but we're going to get into some funky, more barrel stuff that I find very interesting.
Joe, can you talk about malts a little bit and the various malting levels of the various barley strains? If you worry about barley strains at all, or is that even a factor in beer making?
Yeah, that's a good idea. A good idea and a good point, because I usually end up kind of bemoaning the fact that people care about hops, but they don't care about grains as much. The soul of beer. Barley is historically the most popular brewing grain, and there are a variety of reasons for it, but it also makes poor bread. So like over time, it just kind of always evolved into this this grain that we can use for brewing. We use primarily 2-row, and what that means is when you look at the actual barley head itself, there are 2 kernels on each row rather than 6. So 2 and 6 are the 2 main varietals that are used. 2-row is a little plumper. Basically, the plant is each individual kernel is a little bit fatter. And if you were to just take barley and try to make a beer out of barley, you would not be very successful. Barley on its own is basically just a little tiny seed full of starch. So you need to trick that seed of starch into creating sugar for you before you want to brew with it. And that is something that a maltster does. So we have kind of, as an industry, moved away from malting our own grains over many hundred years of industrialization, because malting your own grains is extremely hard. It's very hard. It's a completely different science than brewing. And it's everything. The fact that we have dedicated maltsters means that we as brewers can pick from a catalog of delicious things when we decide we want to make a beer. Everything we've tasted on the pale side thus far, and maybe everything we taste today besides the BRIG Stout, is going to be focused on Pilsner and two-row malt. So the lightest grains, they're barely cooked. They produce a golden bright beer. And we actually have, between our two buildings, 2 silos full of the base grain that goes into all of those beers. So that's a malt silo filled with malt that we then crush and turn into flour in our brew house. We add water. We start to cook that. And we essentially create a slurry of starches that starts to turn into sugar in the brew house. And the thing about like having a relationship with the maltster, like there's a great maltster in Hadley, Massachusetts. So her name is Andrea. Her business is called Valley Malt. And she and her husband Christian moved to Western Mass and wanted to open a brewery that kind of expressed the agricultural heritage of where they were living. So they said, okay, I know that this farmer down here is growing some hops, and who locally is growing malt? Okay, this guy's got some barley on his farm. Maybe we can use some of that. But like, all right, so I'll just use a local maltster. And in the course of looking for a local maltster, realized that the only maltster was a huge conglomerate in the upper Midwest, or you can go to Canada at that point. And there was nobody doing local malting. Now, taking that grain and turning it into malt, as I said, is kind of this whole science to it. And it really like almost, I would say 80% of the time defines the color of the beer that we're talking about. So if you want a black beer, you're going to use a fair amount of dark malt. And dark malt is malt that is cooked by a maltster with a specific degree of humidity, with a specific type of heat for a specific period of time. And you're really like converting sugar into flavor. So when we get a darker malt, you have a ton of flavor and less sugar. And in designing a beer, almost every beer we produce, in fact, I would say every beer we produce has 2-row or Pilsner in it as a base, and then it is flavored with some of those darker malts. Let's see. Outside of Springdale IPAs, I'm going to pull it. I can pull up the group chat in the corner. So I've done a few of these. Apparently, I haven't done enough. Outside of Springdale IPAs, top 3 IPA style and why? Interesting question. We can talk about grain actually as we move into some of these next beers. But the question for my favorite IPAs, I would say outside of what we do, I love a beer called Blind Pig IPA from Russian River Brewing in California, Santa Rosa, California. They just opened a new brewery out there. It's a beautiful brewery. It's a beautiful beer. Vinny and his wife are responsible for double IPA in American craft brewing, and they're responsible for a huge amount of innovation that's hop forward and actually barrel focused. So I just have a soft spot for that beer. I would just shoehorn in Sierra Nevada Pale Ale just because it's a beautiful beer, and it may not be really an IPA, but I think it expresses IPA characteristics almost perfectly. And I would be kind of torn with the third one. If is anyone here a Heady Topper fan from The Alchemist in Vermont? I love that beer, but I also love the hop forward expressions from Hill Farmstead. So some of his beers, they're kind of like classic New England style. Some of the first juicy beers that really came out, and Sean Hill was one of the first guys to kind of point out, like, the people who are buying these IPAs, they don't like IPAs. They like this type of IPA, which is not that bitter, which is fruity and juicy and something else. So I'm enamored with that idea and that concept, and that's why we produce a series of New England IPAs at this point, because we get to kind of play month to month with a different expression. And I don't think we'd be able to do that without standing on the shoulders of guys who kind of perfected the style and started us thinking in a whole different mindset, a whole different paradigm than we had been before. To IPA, like when I came in about in the industry 12 years ago, IPA was just how bitter can you make it? How many IBUs? IBUs are how we measure bitterness in a beer, international bittering units. It's really like a really kind of crude measurement for the alpha acids that are in the product. By itself doesn't tell you a lot, but breweries would be like, I remember having 1,000 IBU beer that was like sucking on grass clippings, and everybody was trying to out bitter the next person. The thing with that is you are closing yourself off from other human beings as you do that, because you're not going to convert anybody from drinking light lager to a triple IPA just by pouring them a glass of an incredibly bitter beer. Bitter is a super complex flavor. It's something that works in some situations, but like this new school of New England IPA kind of moved away from just being bitter for bitter's sake towards like hedonistic, delicious expression of character. Lovely. I'm going to pour a bottle of beer. I'm going to go with, so I have Pineapple Mayhem in front of me here. Do you guys have that? Cool. We did this right. This is great. I'm going to crack that one. This is a straight golden beer with pineapple juice. It's been a while since I've had it. Right as marijuana is being legalized in Massachusetts, our owner was looking at a dispensary, not that he doesn't ever touch it, the stuff, but he was like, Pineapple Mayhem is a funny name for a weed strain. We're going to call it beer that. And so we had pineapple in barrels already. When we're playing with fruit is, like hops, an ingredient that we put in the final product, but we can play with, like hops, we can play with fruit in a variety of different ways. Ooh, funky. Yummy. When we are talking about our barrel program, we're almost always adding the fruit to the barrels. There's some exceptions to that, but we're really like, fruit is an extra fermentable. So the same way that we're taking grain and malted grain and creating sugar out of it and then fermenting that sugar with yeast, we can intensify that characteristics by adding more sugar from a variety of different sources. When we're designing a sour beer in the brew house, it starts with the mash. So when I was talking about using grain, how we crush grain from our grain silos, add it to water, start to cook it, that first process there is called the mash. The mash is what activates the sugars in the beer and unpacks those complicated carbohydrates of sugars into smaller packets of carbohydrates that our yeast can eat up. Now, if we do a really good job of converting those starches into sugars in the mash tun, we don't leave a lot of sugar for our yeast to consume. And if we, I'm sorry, I just flipped that on myself. If we do a really great job, we create a lot of sugar out of the starch, and we basically can, what we would call dry out a beer very quickly when we do that. Drying out means getting rid of sugar, taking the sugar and turning it into alcohol, CO2, and flavor. But when we want a sour beer, we want to actually have an ineffective mash. We want to have complicated carbohydrates that our regular brewer's yeast cannot access. So we have food for the yeast in our barrels. That's the first difference. The second difference I already mentioned was not hopping beers like that. So when we normally say that, when we do all of our hopping in the brew kettle, we do some hopping when we are intending to produce a sour beer, but we do a lot less of it. So the max bittering units, IBUs, for us is 7 IBUs when we want to create a sour beer. And then our initial fermentation is either ale or lager yeast. Doesn't matter to us which one, kind of what is available in the brewery. And the reason it doesn't matter is because we know we're going to start a secondary and a tertiary fermentation in barrel with yeasts that are going to be a lot louder and a lot more hungry for sugar and a lot more expressive than what we're doing in our primary fermentations. We found over time that one of our beers that predates Springdale was a beer called Creek Mythology. It was one of the first, maybe the second barrel-aged beer we produced at Springdale. And that beer was started as a Jack's Abbey beer and started as a lager yeast. And there was this whole discussion that started us down the path of opening Springdale Beer Company. Because this beer, this pink beer that aged in bourbon barrels and sour cherries, we can make an argument that this is a lager. Yes, we can, but when we say lager and we say something that's yeast neutral and something that expresses the ingredients of a beer and it's fairly crisp, it is really confusing to look at something like this, which could well be a lager, and say, oh, this is the same as our house lager or our post-shift pilsner, just because they look the same. They're going to be a lot different on the palate. The inspiration for using pineapple doesn't just come from silly weed strain names, but it comes from a beverage called tepache. which is like a fermented pineapple beverage that's Mexican. It's typically spiced on top of it, and there was, for a while, you could get a fairly authentic one produced by a company called Bitter Moons out of New York that was like in a really kind of janky looking screw top plastic bottle with like chunks of pineapple on the bottom of it. And pineapple ferments really well. It's really accessible sugar for yeast to use. And when it ferments and is just right, it's beautiful. What we found, and what the issue with Tepache is that like that fermentation carries out quickly and can carry out over time, over long periods of time. So we were finding that if we didn't finish the fermentation in the barrel, we could have re-fermentation problems, or like have something that became way too funky. So we wanted pineapple juice rather than like whole pineapple solids for this one, as for that reason. And the thing that's unusual and unique about aging in barrels for as a medium for fermentation is you can use brewer's yeast or non-brewer's yeast that we would never let into our quote clean brewery. That kind of speaks back to that one of the first things we talked about like wanting to have our fermentation program be so separate from our lager program. We want to keep these hungry yeasts away from the regular beer, but we do want to create an environment that that they enjoy. These yeasts will eat everything. If we don't feed these yeasts beer in barrels, these yeasts will slowly break down the cellulose in the barrels and turn that into sugar. Yeah, it's and that's specifically Brettanomyces. And if you're a wine producer and you have a Brettanomyces infection in your winery, it can be a huge issue if you don't want that flavor. Now, when we speak about funk and fruit and sourness in these beers, Brettanomyces is the workhorse for fermentation, the quote wild. That's the Brett you can see on some labels when they say Brett. Brettanomyces is really responsible for 80% of the flavor and 80% of the work being done in those barrels. And that's strains of Brett are known to munch on cellulose. And it's what is so challenging if you're a brewery, if you're trying to get, or rather a winery who has an infection that you want to get out of your winery, you have barrels where they will just live in the barrels, and you have to go chase the stuff. They actually end up sulfuring these barrels or throwing them away or selling them to brokers that we buy barrels from. For us, that we like of Brettanomyces fermentation, we're okay with that. We want to encourage that over time. Brettanomyces has a huge variety of strains. There are strains that produce really fruity flavors. The one that we're using here in Pineapple Mayhem already creates kind of a pineapple-y character. So if you were to taste this beer without pineapple, you would still get a pineapple character. We have a large format barrels in the brewery called Foders that we have this strain kind of chewing on and chewing on beer on at all times without any fruit. And then we hit with Lactobacillus or Pediococcus, lactic acid producing bacteria, to create the acidity to kind of round out the flavor. So when we say funk, we're usually talking about characteristics that come from Brettanomyces. And when we say acidity or sourness, we're talking about the lactic acid producing bacteria in the brewery. In rare cases, Brett can also be used for primary fermentation. Usually different strains than what we use in the sour brewery. But it is a really versatile, really fun thing to play with if you know what you're doing and you can keep it away from the rest of your program. It really is the safety issue comes down to Brett most importantly, because you can kind of track lactic acid producing bacteria pretty quickly, but Brett is really slow. It's the one kind of causes the extended lag time in fermentation for us, is waiting for Brett to chew down all those sugars. And it really just kind of works in layers of complexity. So, you know, as soon as it gets past that most complex carbohydrate that's left in the beverage, it'll go dormant into the barrels, and that's when you get like a little bit of chewing on cellulose. I mentioned Foders kind of like offhand there, and Foders, Foeder or Foudre, depending on your Flemish or your French, are large. They're about 10 feet tall for us, wooden vessels that we are fermenting beer in. They are basically exactly analogous to a 55-gallon barrel, just larger, with thicker staves, thicker wood. We're looking for the same type of reactions in there. And as a brewery that blends between a bunch of different beers to create these acid-forward beers, we need to have a lot of blending material in order to get to the final product. So the base blocks of fermentation for us are those foeders that have different cultures going in each one of them. So a lot of our beers, we are taking just kind of a very plain base. Maybe it's just Pearly that's been unhopped and unspiced that we're fermenting with a fruit in a barrel. In some cases, we are blending between foeders, different golden beers. And sometimes we're doing gold, red, and brown beers all at once to kind of come up with a final product that expresses what we want to express. That's, speaking to what we do in the barrel side, it's a lot different than what we do on the brewery side. We kind of take the brewing for granted. We order beer and we put them into barrels. In normal times, we would just a couple times a week be checking in with our beer, and when we're ready to package a beer, it rolls like this. We'll take beer out of barrels. We'll take those barrels, we'll put them into a tank, we'll blend the beer together, make sure that all the flavors in those multiple barrels are married in a way that we'd like. Then we have those empty barrels. We fill those empty barrels from those foeders. We don't clean out all the foeders, but maybe go 7/8 of the way down, leave some beer in there. And we'll have ordered fresh beer that's gone through a primary fermentation next to our Jack's Abbey, pumped through a wall into that foeder to fill it back up and kickstart the next fermentation. So it's actually pretty much like, if any of you have gotten into sourdough baking during this pandemic, because my feed, everybody who wasn't a brewer was doing sourdough starters, and like those of us who are brewers, like we're doing that during the day. We don't need to bring that home. But it's really basically the same thing. You're just feeding this little organism. You're making sure it's happy. You're giving it more beer. And, the only way to find out if it's happy really is to taste it and see if we like what comes out of it. In beers like Pineapple Mayhem, you get that funkiness and the acidity, and that kind of wraps up with the pineapple is kind of the star of the show, and that's what we're looking to highlight in a beer like this.
So Joe, there's a question, Michael Simone. He says, I don't detect typical oak nuances like vanilla and spice, vanilla possibly coming from an American oak, and also the French oak giving more spice and other fruit notes.
Oh, cool. So, wine professional.
How old are your barrels, and what's your rotation like?
It greatly depends on what were in the barrels before. So we actually will get to one beer here tonight in the Smoking Bishop that I think expresses the most amount of like barrel spice in what we're doing. But there are two main schools of thought for how you use barrels in the beer world. And you're either trying to spice the final product with the flavor of what was in that barrel or the barrel itself, or you're trying to kickstart a fermentation. So, we kind of dabble in both sides of it. So I think the best example for both of our breweries is probably our Framingham series, our barrel-aged Framinghams, are aged in bourbon barrels. And we do that. We take a porter and age it in a bourbon barrel to make the porter taste like both the barrel and the bourbon that was in that barrel. I think most of us understand bourbon and whiskey is a dark spirit, but bourbon and whiskey go into those barrels clear and pick up that color and that flavor and that spice from the barrel itself. So there is kind of a gray area when you're trying to flavor a product with the flavor of the barrel itself. You are trying to harness both the flavor of the barrel and what was in the barrel. And sometimes what was in the barrel, like we think of vanilla and bourbon as kind of going hand in hand. But vanilla is a compound that breaks down from lignans that are in wood in that red layer of the barrel. So a charred barrel that has a really fine red layer to it, if you were to age water in there, you would still get vanilla character out of that. So vanilla is not exclusively bourbon driven. So those like the beers that we do that are there to pick up spice from the barrel, we typically use those barrels once for that. So a bourbon barrel might come into the brewery, we'll age bourbon, Framingham in those barrels, and then that first strip of the barrel that comes out will taste the most like what was in it. I will say also, legally, we can't pour bourbon into one of our beers, but we can pour beer on top of a wet bourbon barrel, and that's considered a traditional process. And if there's bourbon in the barrel, that's cool. Can't say that we haven't done our own when we order barrels from brokers, that we haven't opened the barrels and taken some whiskey out of those barrels, because there's just incidental liquid from shipping. So can't say there are any unlabeled bottles of whiskey behind me from various barrel projects. Right.
They say that if you put a wet barrel in a cooler for a day or two, you can get about a quart of or maybe even half gallon of bourbon out of it.
Yeah, I think that that's true. We've done some
Very
experimenting with that.
oily and fatty, isn't it?
Well,
So
when we do that though, where we are usually taking away, we have to think about it like we're taking away character out of the beer when we do that. So some of the extra character that you get from bourbon, some of the extra alcohol is from actual alcohol sitting in those barrels in addition to extra fermentation. But those projects that we're taking a beer and we're trying to like spice it, and we're doing a wine barrel aged beer, again, like a dark beer aged in a Cabernet barrel, for example, we're trying to take that base beer without adding any extra yeast to it and pull that character into the final product. For a lot of what we have here tonight on the golden side, actually maybe all four of our bottles tonight are aged in wine barrels that have less char to them. They had wine in them before, but we will use this barrels 2 or 3 times depending on the type of fruit that goes into them, because we're not as worried about the barrel impact on the final product most of the time. We really want to create an environment that our wild yeast likes. And what our wild yeast wants is some access to oxygen, but not too much. So there are 2 types of reactions that our wild yeast and bacteria want: anaerobic and aerobic reactions. And the thing that's great about barrels is barrels are porous and can breathe. And when they breathe, they can pull in just enough oxygen to spur the aerobic reactions, but not so much that'll tamp down the anaerobic reactions. Now, if we were to pull the bungs up or the heads off our barrels and let them sit, you will get extra character from acetobacter. And acetobacter, acetic acid, is vinegar. It's easy to make a barrel full of vinegar that way, and a barrel full of vinegar is not what we're looking for. Malt vinegar is tasty on French fries. Even in the part of a barrel blend, one barrel that's kind of acetic will come in the final product as a really harsh, sharp acidity that we do not like.
Deepak has a question on that pineapple. And the question is, what's the percent of fruit, in this particular case, pineapple juice, that you add as part of the brewing? And is it added only once in the process, or do you add it over time if you feel that conditions warrant them?
That is a great question. The answer is totally related to the type of fruit we're using and how familiar we are with it. On the raw materials side, we work with a bunch of different fruit purveyors that we might be getting raspberries for a beer that we've done 3 or 4 times. And they might say, hey, like, we have some freshly processed or uterus and boysenberries. And so when we first do it, we'll do a small handful of barrels with it and kind of check in with it. We found that pineapple juice is really loud, quote unquote, in the finished product. It ferments really well. So we only added it once, and it got to where we wanted to get. And we also, if you recall, we identified pineapple character in that beer and wanted to like accentuate that in the final product with that one. So we really wanted to like push it up a little bit with that. But in some fruits like blueberries, you don't have an exact ratio of like adding more blueberry makes it taste like more blueberry. We've actually had the hardest time figuring out, I don't think we've ever done a straight up only blueberry beer, because we've just never been able to like grab the characteristics of blueberry that we love and actually bottle it. We've done blueberry with other things. We've done blueberry and rhubarb. Even one of our favorite sour beer producers, Cantillon, has produced like a handful of blueberry beers every time, and they're like the rarest bottles that they do, because our understanding is like you need an insane amount of it and you need to keep adding to it. When you keep adding fruit to a barrel, we're literally taking the bung off the top of the barrel and putting the fruit back in and capping it. Every time I open one of the barrels, I'm inviting whatever's in the air into that barrel. So what I mentioned about acetic acid, like we ideally want to be thieving as little as possible out of the top of the barrel. So what we do to taste these barrels, we drill nails into the side of the barrels, and we put stainless steel nails in the barrels, pull the nail out, catch it, put the nail back in. That minimizes our need to go into each of these barrels by popping the top. And we would normally not get much beyond like 2 or 3 different fruitings of a beer, and it has to be a pretty specific case. I think it does kind of speak to a little bit to the philosophy of blending for us, that question, and it kind of speaks to this beer. Sometimes we walk into a beer and we say, okay, I want to accentuate the pineapple character of this beer. I'm going to put pineapple in this beer that already tastes a little bit like pineapples. And we might have an idea of where we're going to end up. And sometimes we're totally in experimental mode. We have a new fruit we're playing with. We've never used it before. We'll toss it in some barrels and we'll see what happens. Smoking Bishop. Ready? We brought this beer to EBF, Extreme Beer Fest, for the first time this year. It was kind of debut of this beer. And EBF happens in February. And it's this like celebration of weird stuff in beer and weird types of beers. And I had a pickle beer and an onion beer and a kimchi beer this year. And none of them were any good, but they're all interesting in their own way. We wanted to bring something that we knew was going to be tasty, that was definitely different. And this is the beer that I was thinking was going to express more barrel character than some of our other ones. So when I was explaining what this was, you're standing and there's people in line and you're trying to say this thing over and over again. I was saying it's a Dickensian mulled wine cocktail inspired barrel blend with grapes. So to unpack that, Smoking Bishop, like the name, comes from like some Victorian era mulled wine cocktail. So like a hot wine cocktail, which we thought was kind of a fascinating thing and something that's kind of fallen out of favor, fallen out of history over time. But mulled wine cocktails are something that I can't cop to it being a cocktail, but like I remember like mulled cider in a hot like warmer as like a very like specific childhood memory of winter. So we wanted something that like had some richness and sweetness to it that had like the spice. So I have to cop to reading it off of here because it's cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, and orange peel. A whole host of different spices. Spices that can be sweet, can be spicy, depending. And we actually added it to a Barbera base. So it's Barbera wine grapes in red wine barrels. Not cool enough to have Barbera barrels and Barbera grape juice, but we tried. But red wine barrels with wine juice on top of it that we then spice. The spicing happens like the Basil beer very late in the process for us. The spice just picks up so quickly that even being in bottle over time, I think I may not have had this beer since Extreme Beer Fest. It's been such a strange timing away from the brewery.
So these are French oak barrels?
These are French oak red wine barrels, yes. We have a collection of, it probably goes like French, American, Hungarian by like frequency of barrels in our collection. There's a whole other business that most people don't get to see of barrel brokers who kind of work between spirit producers and wine producers and breweries like ourselves, who grab barrels when they're done. One of the defining characteristics of bourbon whiskey is aged in charred new American oak. So once those barrels go through one aging cycle for these distilleries, they're basically useless, and those guys don't want to deal with it. They want to sell it to somebody who can sell it to someone else. And that intermediate layer of people we work with, like Rocky Mountain Barrels, Riverside Barrels in Maine. Excuse me. Those guys all take those barrels, wrap them, make sure that they're kept the right way, and then move them to other breweries and other distilleries who want to age on bourbon barrels, age on wine barrels. Some of these barrels that went into this blend came from the Hall Winery in California. The winemaker of Hall Winery is the cousin of one of our sales managers, and we just got this connection, and they sent us this truckload of beautiful California Pinot Noir barrels that were French oak barrels that we aged a bunch of beer in, and that we're on like the third turn of those barrels now, and they're all wonderful, and there's I think it's about half those and a half mix of other barrels from the brewery. But when we use it for us, what was a new fruit and Barbera fruit for this, we age in a variety of different barrels to see what we like the most and see if we want to blend them back together or do them on their own or how we want to play it. With the case of this one, we really like those Hall barrels, and we blended a couple of the other barrels in, but it is really dominated by that French oak wine barrel character. Ooh,
this is beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Here.
much different, I think, than the other ones, which is a
Okay.
fun different expression for us here. I've actually kind of let it mull by sitting it in my hot apartment here as I melt.
So, Joe, what's the smallest? Do you do single barrel beer also, or is always typically always blended? It's not really worth it.
We
Single barrel.
for a couple of different, honestly, kind of boring reasons, we usually do 3 barrels at a time. The vessels that we have to package out of take so much time, and there's actually like an amount of beer that's lost in that process that if we were to try to do that with 1 barrel, we'd have a hard time getting the finished product where we want to go. So typically speaking, we usually take 3 barrels, but what we'll do when we want to like highlight 1 barrel that's particularly special is we might take a barrel that has like a lot of specific barrel character and then pair it with a couple of neutral barrels or pair it with our foeders. So the other thing that's important to note about foeders, those large vessels that we have, the ratio of contact of oak to liquid is different than that in a 55-gallon barrel. So that you definitely get less wood character and way more beer character out of those barrels. So if we want to, like, for example, highlight like a rum barrel or something, we can take like pretty neutral wood beer and like pair that with a really like wood forward expression of ours, and kind of like let that barrel shine. We've worked on some stuff, and we're actually in the middle of working on some stuff with Bully Boy, who's a distillery in Boston.
Right.
We grabbed a couple barrels from them, and we took in what we would call jump, moved beer from kind of aged beer from some barrels that were fairly neutral into these like fresher whiskey barrels to just kind of pull as much whiskey character out as possible. We did that in, gosh, I think we started that in January, and definitely have lost track over the last last 6 months that those barrels are there. But those barrels are kind of cranking away. When you're looking to get like whiskey character out of a barrel, we usually only need to spend 3 to 6 months to get that character out of a barrel. If we want extra fermentation, spice, funk, the whole kind of expression, we usually take closer to a year for that to happen.
You know why I asked the question, because the last time we chatted, we were about to pick a barrel from Privateer, Maggie Campbell.
Yeah.
And I know you were busy that evening, so couldn't join us, but we got a little carried away, and I think the rums were excellent, and we ended up picking 3. So,
oh, that's amazing.
yeah, but it's going to be 3 different barrels. One of them is American oak. The other one is ex-Lafroig barrel, Scotch barrel, right? And then the third one is going to be a fresh Armagnac barrel. So it's going to be rum aged in a fresh Armagnac barrel. So you're looking at American oak, which is ex-bourbon, and then you're looking at American oak, which is ex-Scotch, Lafroig, and the third one is going to be rum aged in a ex-Armagnac barrel, which is French oak. So 3 different characteristics, but we'll get the barrels in 3 different stages. They won't come at the same time. So we are hoping that to do something special. You see these 3 people here with red shirts. It's a club that we are, they have their hands up. So we are celebrating our 25th anniversary as a club also. So we want to have something special.
Very cool.
Remember that why. So we are hoping that we can look at something where we can experiment with something like this.
I'm a soccer fiend, so when you guys came on first, I was like, are those Gooners jerseys? But
these are actually cricket.
I got you. I'm a Liverpool guy over here, so we can cheers the victory there. That's really cool. Maggie and the folks at Privateer are
amazing,
friends of ours, and they just do an amazing thing with a spirit that has a ton of history in New England. And I was in the store recently, and I saw the collection you have of the distiller's drawer and Queenshare stuff is awesome. Like that stuff is really really beautiful. We've gotten a chance to kind of trade stabs. Elias, sorry, we'll talk about that later. Man, you all day. What they're doing and the fact that we were able to kind of trade our stabs back and forth to learn about each other's process was really special. And she's also like a leader for diversity and inclusion in her industry. So she's like a really great person to listen to and follow. And so good to see local people doing right. I appreciate that myself. I pour a full glass of BRIG myself. This is a great way to, I would say, a great way to end the session. But like I said, you can continue it at your leisure. This is our Mocha Stout. Probably the thing that expresses grain and malt character the most of what we have here today. So this has lactose in it, so you know, should say so on the can. I know it does, right? Somewhere. And it is an expression of dark malts and dark malt character. So I mentioned, I kind of skimmed over coloring a beer and how we do that and how we make that decision. But if you recall, I said that all of our beers have a variety of two-row and pale malt in them. But this dark color comes from using darker malts. Now, the thing when you use dark malts in a beer, the malts that we get that are dark, or they're between like caramel all the way to roasted chocolate, all those are really just that same barley kernel toasted or roasted for specific periods of time at different humidities. When you do that, you're removing sugar, but you're adding flavor. So if you were to try to make a beer that's this dark with just roasted malts, you would use hundreds and hundreds of pounds extra, maybe like even, I don't know what the math would be, but a lot more if you weren't using pale malt to be like the body of the beer. Because you still need to have the alcohol in the final product to ferment. And if you're using just fully roasted malts, there's just not enough sugar to feed a yeast culture. So it's kind of a key to an early bit of industrialization, that learning to make beer with a mixture of lighter malts and darker malts that still express this same like inky black color was one of the advances that kind of spurred beer into like a global commodity as it is now. This beer uses lactose, as I mentioned, and lactose like it comes actually in these funny brown bags that say Brewster's cheese, just like a picture of a wedge of cheese on them. But it's the same lactose you find in milk, same kind of sugar. And the reason it's useful for us is that brewer's yeast, which is ale yeast in this case, does not touch lactose. We'll leave lactose behind in the final product, and that's a way for us to adjust sweetness in the final product and keep a balanced beer. You'll see this beer referred to sometimes, or this style, as sweet stouts or milk stouts. And really that it's just a dark beer that uses some lactose to balance it and kind of add a degree of sweetness. As you use roastier malts, you actually have bitterness that is not coming from the hop, but is coming from that roast character. So you want to be able to balance it out from the final product. I would say, like, so this beer is 6.7, 6.8%. This is, for us, fairly mild on the stout side. In like the American craft beer sense, there are stouts that are up to 20% alcohol. We do that here because we actually age a version of this beer in barrels, and we don't want that version to be crazy. So that version, maple barrel aged Brigadero, goes to 8.5% over about 3 months in maple and bourbon barrels. The maple barrels are ex-bourbon barrels, and then edge maple in about a third of those, and then it's 2/3 bourbon barrels, and that's for the bourbon barrel aged version of this. But the base beer, we want it to be kind of moreish and something that you could like have at the end of a meal without hitting you over the head with intensity. So like 7% is definitely strong, but it's something you can have a glass of or have 16 ounces of without worrying for your own safety. When you roast malts, or you roast coffee, or you roast chocolate, there's a reaction that happens called the Maillard reaction. That's non-enzymatic browning. It's really like the same thing that's happening when you have the crust and a good piece of meat, right? That reaction, the Maillard reaction, is what causes all those grains and sugars to kind of coalesce into a center of different flavors. So when you roast malt, I kind of mentioned offhand chocolate malt. Chocolate malt does taste like chocolate, but it's just malt that's been roasted to a specific level. In this beer, we're using coffee, cacao nibs, and roasted malt to kind of coalesce on the center of all of those delicious, dark, decadent flavors. With all that roastiness, we use the lactose to kind of balance it out and create a roundness to it So it's not defined by the roasty character of the beer. I'm going to take another sip. I see a question about Quarantined in You. That's a beer that I couldn't get because we're out of it. You guys got it, and I appreciate you. That's a beer that was, as the name suggests, it was a product of our boredom in quarantine and trying to do something fun. We produced a beer the past few years called Good New, which is a Citra and Galaxy-focused New England IPA. We wanted to try a double version of it. We were no longer able to use the name Quarantine in You, and we kind of changed our Good New rather. We kind of changed our hop program and our IPA program over the past year. So we kind of like cheekily called that one Quarantined in You because we were kind of bored and kind of going a little stir crazy in our little apartments, being like, okay, well, let's have some fun while we're here. The thing that's maybe interesting to some of you about like what happens to breweries when all of a sudden the draft is taken out of the picture for us is that putting beer into a can is a lot more labor intensive than putting a beer into a keg. So on March 11th, we kegged our last beer until the past month. And all of a sudden, all the beers in our tanks had no homes. So we had to scramble and figure out what to do with it all. And we ended up doing a lot of cans of things that were supposed to be draft only. They were supposed to go to restaurants. They were supposed to go to our restaurant. And so we will probably into the end of this month be canning more beer than we ever have in our entire existence. It's a 7-day-a-week operation now. We have 2 separate teams working. As much as I like to talk about how I help guide the vision of our brewery, what ends up happening is when you get into a position like mine, you don't actually do the brewing on a daily basis. You're not in there getting sweaty with the beer. And those guys have been our heroic front line for the last 4 months, and that entire process is like really, really interesting to kind of follow, just because we went from doing 4 days a week of canning and kegging with 1 day a week of maintenance, and we were off on the weekends, to splitting our teams in 2 for fear of one team getting sick and not being able to come to the brewery. So we have 2 teams that never cross over, that stay apart from each other, that are doing it 7 days a week for 4 months straight. And it will be 5 months when we see the end of it. Just because restaurants are starting to turn back on for us, we're starting to keg a little bit. I mean, that little bit of kegging for us kind of saves a lot of sweat, a lot of man hours, and a lot of sanity on our part. So I guess I would kind of wrap that thought into what we're doing by saying thank you for supporting us, for drinking our beer, for chatting with us, for being involved in local beer and local culture for us. I think it's absolutely vital. We can't do what we do without our local people who want to support us. And there are a lot of breweries, we're not immune to it whatsoever, that are really seeing tough days behind us, but some more tough days ahead. And I think it's really heartening to be with people who care enough to ask questions and spend their Friday night hanging out with a humble worker and talks about my beer and our beer like this. And I really appreciate y'all hanging out with me.
That's great. Now, Joe, somebody who shall remain unnamed because he has sent me a private message, and I will just read it. Now that we have 5 cans and 3 bottles opened, how do we store these so that it's still drinkable in the next few days?
Yeah, that is tough to do. You can, especially for what I do is I have little wine stoppers I'll put on the bottles, and I'll kind of check in with them. The thing with opening a beer, that's true. It's once you do, it is best to. Those of you who have multiple people on camera are doing it the right way, and then you get to share most of it now. But it is, especially for the hop forward cans, I would say that if you're going to drink more tonight, the hop forward cans, I would take care of those, and you can put plastic wrap over them and kind of come back for more the next couple of days. As soon as beer starts interacting with oxygen, it changes. So it'll be different tomorrow, and it will be not the same as it is here, but that's still part of the process, and it's still worthy something we do to check in. I mean, this beer won't be going down my drain either, and I won't be drinking it all today as much as I'd like to. But I think it's something you you can kind of learn what oxidation in a beer tastes like. It can be actually really pleasant. A lot of barrel aged beers kind of have that as part of the flavor profile anyway. So you're just kind of like turning that flavor up a little bit if you let it sit. And obviously in the fridge. If I didn't say in the fridge, definitely in your fridge, unless you have like a really, really nice AC, in which case you should invite me over, because I think I'm sweating through this shirt by the time we are done with this call here. Go back to the Liverpool tank top next.
You really like Liverpool, don't you?
I do. It's true. But they're one of the first. Soccer was one of the first things to come back where I was like, finally, like live sport. So that was fun to watch.
Right.
Do you guys have any other questions for the group or things I can? Oh, I see a new question. Brewing is an art or a science? Controlled process or combination? Oh, that is a great question. So if cooking is sex and baking is science, lager brewing is science, and blending is the sex of what we do. It's the art of what we do. Lager production, ale production is tightly controlled in a tightly controlled environment under certain temperature constraints. We know that these yeast strains that have been grown up over generations will do a certain thing if you give them a certain parameters and a certain amount of food. And it's really as simple as following that process and developing that process and being able to repeat that process. Unsexiest advice for any home brewers: just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Whatever the mildest tasting beer you produce is, try to do that even better each time and do it over and over again. That's the science of it. The sex and the art of it comes on the side of the barrel blending, because we're really just taking ingredients that are that exist, and we're asking ourselves, what does this remind us of? Where does this take us? Does it take us someplace new? Does it ask for something? Does it want for spice, for fruit, for thyme, for extra barrel? For us, there is no sensory, there's no tool that tells us that besides the tool of our palates. So it's true. We've all opened a bunch of bottles here, a bunch of cans, and we're really training our palates to work for us when we do this. I usually, like when we're tasting barrels in the brewery, we get to about 5 or 6 barrels, and you kind of like toast your palate to some extent, and that's where the blank seltzers and the saltines come in for us, try to reset a little bit. But really, it is a mixture of the two, and it's a fascinating mixture of the two. And I think it's a great question. It's something that we're always going to have to answer differently every time we tuck into it. But that's how I view it anyway.
I have a question.
Chris, hello.
Bringing beer from cold to warm, does that change the flavor at all? I know if it's a clear bottle, the light exposure will change it, but a can or a dark bottle, does that actually affect flavor?
It does. It doesn't affect flavor nearly as much as the kind of the myth propagates. And I remember my first industry job was when I left hospitality and hotels behind. I started working in a store. That was one of the number one thing is like, well, I can't take this beer into my car because it's in your cooler and then it will skunk. So the verb skunking and skunking beer specifically speaks to light struck. So to your point, clear bottles of beer, when they are exposed to UV light of any kind, and even green bottles and to a lesser extent brown bottles, will quote skunk. And that is a specific flavor that's created in that. And it's a flavor that's in hops actually. And there is a proprietary hop oil thing that doesn't skunk. So like all Miller products that are in clear bottles, like Miller High Life, doesn't skunk. I mean, it's as skunked as it is when you get it. But when you're talking about moving a beer back and forth between temperatures, you really have to mistreat it in order to have that make a huge difference. What makes a bigger difference is long time held at hot temperature. So like my bar cart behind me doesn't have any beer on it because like this room is, as I'm discovering at 9 o'clock, it's 80 degrees in here. Is not what you want your beer to be sitting at on a daily basis. But going from the fridge to 80 and back to the fridge, you're really talking more time in the fridge. And it also does depend on whether or not you're talking about a live product. A live product is a can conditioner, bottle conditioned product that has live yeast in the bottle. Live yeast works as a buffer between spoilage. But if you get the live yeast moving and then you kill it and you bring it back again, you can induce certain off flavors. But long story short, if you're taking it from the cold box at the store into your car and letting it sit for a while, it's not great that it's sitting for a while warm, but it's not going to kill the beer. It'll still taste good.
And as you know, with the Alchemist, they say, keep this can cold. Now, you go up there, you buy your beer, you spend the night, you drive home. Should that be cold the entire time? But I mean, that's just their slogan, so I get that. But 4-hour drive home with
yeah. My very well-meaning aunt and uncle came back from Stowe last summer, and they were like, we purchased a cooler for you and we put ice packs in it just to keep them. I'm like, I appreciate it, thank you. And it was tasty, but I've had it sitting in the back of my car for 4 hours and not in a cooler, and it's fine.
Actually, speaking of that, last weekend, went up there, got Hill Farmstead and Alchemist, and had 2 coolers in the trunk.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a fine way to do it. I think what you'll find is that beer is a very resilient product. I mean, all the advances that have happened in the beer world to keep beer over time, Sierra Nevada is actually a great example of this. Sierra Nevada has done all this work and all this R&D work, research for craft brewers to be like 38 degrees is the temperature that beer keeps best at. When they ship pallets of beer across the country, they ship it with these little stickers on the side of it that show when that beer went outside of that temperature range and how long it was outside of that temperature range. And you can decide as a wholesaler to refuse that beer. And they enforce those standards through their supply chain because they're big enough to do it. But they did the work to find out how to extend their beer over time and how to make sure that Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, if you have it at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, tastes like day one. They did that work. So all of us can stand on their shoulders and do the right thing to our beer and enforce those same standards. And then the irony of all of that is that New England IPA with hop particulates and yeast particulates in the can just toss so much of that out the window because so many of those beers, if you mistreat them, are hoppy beers, and as well as many others that are heavily dry hop that have yeast particulate in the can. Those are the ones that are going to suffer the most from temperature fluctuation, from age, from time hot. Those beers all do the worst in sensory when they're heated up to 70 degrees, even for a few days. All that being said, if you're coming back from Vermont for a couple hours, I think you will be better than you think, and your beer will still taste good when it does that. But that is, of course, the cruel irony of the whole thing. All this work was done to preserve the product, and now, as consumers, we're so conditioned to be like, oh, it's more than 2 weeks old. I would might as well throw it away. I found out the other day, actually, that my 85-year-old neighbor who I gave beer to for snowshoeing, or rather snow shoveling for us last year. That's a long story. But he used a snowblower for us, and he's like, oh, I gave it to my son-in-law, but it was a month old, so he got rid of it. And I was like, those were our Jack Sabby lagers. Those are fine. That was a waste. But good to know. Next time I'll give you day-old beer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, they just ship beer from England to India and through the Cape of Good Hope, and used to take 3.5 months in ships. This is before IPA was even a term, and the beer used to be okay. People used to still drink it. I guess the standards of beer have completely changed over the years. I suppose, right? In some ways.
Yeah, and it's actually a really good point for how we got to hopping beer, to that antimicrobial thing. I mean, hops are a really reliable way to protect a beer from spoilage. And by protecting a beer from spoilage, it kind of falls on the sword for the rest of the beer. So the hop characteristics die out over this 3.5 months at sea, but the beer doesn't have any harmful spoilers in it. It just, isn't as hop forward as it was when it was first brewed. But speaking to hop varietals and flavors is a newfangled invention. As I mentioned, that starts in the 1980s for us. I mean, it was really just a way to keep the beer from killing people that it was meant for. So really, hops kind of die first, which is why when we talk about New England IPA in particular, where there's like actual physical hop particulate in the can, that will die and will be less pleasant to drink after 3 months at sea, no doubt. But most beer is just fine.
Right. There are a lot of whiskey guys here in this group when we are tasting beer. But and you talked about this a little bit. There's some sulfur introduced in beer. Do you see when sulfur comes into the beer, and do you taste the sulfur? And if that happens, is that a good thing, bad thing? How do you deal with that? Because especially when using wine cask, I think Michael can probably attest to that. You know, there's more sulfur probably with the sulfur candles or whatever, and using those ex-wine barrels. You know, how do you deal with that? You know, with beer.
Well, we interact with sulfur the most in our lager production, actually. So our lager yeast and lots of lager yeasts will produce a lot of sulfur. Now, our lager production, not to get too technical, but to lager, the verb to lager is to store, in German to lager. And lager production is done cold for long periods of time. And you don't get the same natural blow off of sulfur that you would get in ale fermentation in a lager fermentation. So you do get in the final product like a sulfur characteristic, especially when you open a can or a bottle of a lager. That is historically a thing that we expect to find in lager. So it's, I think, something that we expect to see in those beers and that we don't mind. It's also extremely volatile. So when it's introduced to oxygen and introduced to your glass, or even when you just open it, you'll get this whiff of sulfur, sometimes like a struck match character that kind of disappears fairly quickly, especially if you're pouring it. So you don't get this as much with draft beer in our experience as you do with like a canned beer, where it's like, you know, contained and hasn't hit oxygen yet. In the barrel production side, we do occasionally run into like some sulfur, but those are more like for us off flavors that we know that we can work through. And there are ways and processes that we can work through them, from scrubbing with CO2. So we use like a carbonation stone to kind of like push some of the sulfur out, and it's really like kind of like agitating the beer with small bubbles of sulfur. And there are also off flavors that are sulfur driven that we can't move by. And part of that process, I kind of glossed over the fact like we put beer in these barrels and we taste them and when they're ready to come out. But there are a lot of really fairly unpleasant flavors that can come out of those barrels before they're ready. But we understand some of them as part of the brewing process. So good examples of those are like butter characteristics and certain types of acidities that are harsh that we know that the beer will move behind. And like, not to be indelicate, but like there's a farty character to some of these fermentations that when it's like contained in a barrel, when you pour it, you're like, this is not pleasant, but you have to like move by the farty eggy thing and like taste what's under it and understand that when you condition that beer and when you package it and you introduce CO2, you will move past those flavors pretty quickly. So that's our experience with it, at least in our perspective. It's probably a little different than the wine and the spirit world, where you like have sulfured barrels that you're pouring liquid into directly that might actually pick up some of that.
That's interesting. You mentioned that lagers, because of anaerobic. Lagers are bottom fermenting, right? Yeast strains, right? So and many of them come from Germany, and in Scotland, when these different distilleries, they have these single barrels, and a barrel, if it is sulfured, they designate it to the German, German contingent, because apparently Germans have a very high appetite for sulfur, because they're probably used to the sulfur with lagers and sauerkraut and things like that, so they're in their diet, sulfur is a common thing. But in some other countries, sulfur may not be that common. So perhaps there is something to that.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I didn't realize that. That's a good little note. Makes sense though. I mean, lager production is hundreds of years old, but I mean, it's still kind of the new kid on the block in a lot of ways.
Right. Hey guys, any other questions? Musa, you just came in very late. I hope you had a good Friday night.
Hi, Musa. How are you?
Yeah, I told you what I was doing, right? Playing golf. Hello, everyone.
Correct.
So sorry I joined in late, but I just texted Elias. I'm just starting off with the Pearly here. Checked it
Nice.
out. You know,
You're only 9 years behind us, Musa. You'll be fine. You'll get there.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. I'll try and catch up by next month. Yeah. But great lineup. Really appreciate everything you've done and you're doing. Thank you.
Oh yeah, appreciate
Great
that.
question about the sulfur too, Bikram.
Thank you, Musa.
Yeah.
And we have been to, as a great club, we have been to, many times at the beer hall at Jack's Abbey. It's been a lot of fun. And this is the first time for me to taste this, lineup of Springdale beers, and they're phenomenal. I really like sour beer. I feel that a lot of people don't appreciate that. The complexity in sour beer is, so much more than just the sourness that comes with it. You have to get past it, and there's so much more. And so really enjoyed your explanation. And we need to do this again, Elias. Nice setup. That's great. And I really hope that we can do
this is a lot. One of my favorite things to do with our sales team is to just hang out and at a store for a night, open some bottles with people and just tell stories and share stories. And, we learn so much from these things, from the questions that y'all are asking, from the things that people connect to, going back to the idea of this being more art than science, because it's so sensory and hedonistically driven for us, it's great to hear how people taste things and how they describe things and how they connect to them. And, we're constantly trying to train our people to be like, don't try to use the language that is in the book. Use the language that makes sense to you. Just because that buttery is diacetyl, trying to say that is trying to say something else. Really connect it. If you think it tastes like buttered popcorn, say buttered popcorn. I always use the Jolly Rancher example. Maybe you think it tastes like green Jolly Rancher. Just say that. Don't try to find the technical term. And doing these types of tastings with folks. I mean, we make a product that anyone can drink and enjoy. So trying to over explain things and over analyze them is useless. It really is supposed to be fueling post golf sessions on a Friday night. That's what beer's about, is hanging out with people and learning stuff. So
trust me, this crew doesn't mind getting into isolamal alcohol for banana peels. It's all cool. We dig it.
Well, this is a good crew then. I appreciate it.
Any other questions, guys? I mean, this has been so much fun, talking to somebody who's making beer and pushing the boundaries of beer in so many different ways. Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed it. And Nitesh, Shea, you've been very quiet. What's up? Any questions for you guys? Ravi, other than what to do with the beer?
No, I think this was really great. I mean, I've now been to a beer tasting before for some reason. Very surprising, but I loved all the beers. I am like you. I am more partial to the sour beers, and I'm going to finish that tonight. Okay. I'm going to try to store the other beers until breakfast tomorrow.
All right.
Let's hope the last. So, but thank you, Joe. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much for coming, y'all. I really appreciate y'all for asking great questions and challenging me and having some beers with me on a Friday night. It was awesome. I can't wait to join the club here and hang out in person and drink some whiskey and some rum at the store. So
absolutely,
I got a crash pad in Walpole. It's about 1.5 miles from the store. I'm excited. We're gonna do it.
Yeah, I think Uber still exists, so that's good too.
So, Joe, is the Jack Abbey open still, or it's in the?
Oh, yeah. See, that would be the kind of question that our sales team would like me to plug, right? We are open from Wednesday through Sunday right now. We built a patio. Right now, we are staffed to either open the patio or open inside. We don't have enough people back yet to do both. We are doing a full menu. We turned our draft system on today, so you can get draft beer. I had my first draft beer yesterday after 4 months. Draft beer is different than canned and bottled beer, so it was great to taste that. And we have a full menu, and I think we're at the moment reservation only. You can just make a reservation on our website if you go to jacksabbey.com, and that's also where you'll find all the Springdale beers right now. So we do have a Springdale Tap Room that we don't have an ETA on that opening at this point. We're still waiting to see, where everything goes in a few months. Obviously,
is the kitchen open too?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have the kitchen. We've got pizzas going, wood-fired pizzas. We've got a couple of new items we've added to the menu in the last few months. So there's a lot of reason to visit.
So I live 2 miles. I live 2 miles from where you guys are, so it's.
Oh, perfect.
I go there very regularly, so not lately, but obviously. Thank you.
Chris,
yeah, of course.
Did it get answered, Chris Pila? You had a question. Did it get answered, or did you get to ask the question?
I asked it in chat. Does the Jack W. Beer Hall offer Springdale? Because you just said Springdale's tap room is not there yet. Yes.
We do have Springdale beers available on the Jack's Draft Tower. We're looking at, we normally had, I think, 24 draft lines at Jack's Abbey. And I think we're turning 12 on this weekend just to restart everything. I mean, draft systems are pretty resilient, but they're not meant to just shut off suddenly for 4 months. So we spent a lot of time cleaning it and putting it back together. So we're kind of like starting out fairly slowly this weekend, and I think our beer selection will grow over time. So we do have Springdale and Jack's Abbey beers available on the patio. I think the way it works right now is you literally scan a QR code in your table, brings you to your table, and you can add stuff to your order, which is pretty convenient. So and weird, but I think that's how it is now. Well, I appreciate all of y'all. I'm probably going to have to go and cool down a bit. And I thank you guys all for your time. It was really great to share some beers with you.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate you taking the time on Friday, and we'll do this again. Hopefully talk about the barrels too. Cheers. Salute.
Yes, I look forward to that. Cheers, y'all. Have a great night.
Sure.
Bye.